I think people tend to know that I have a twin brother. And my brother and I went to college together. The university that we went to has a program where you can study in Europe at a campus in Austria. I was never able, but my brother was able for a semester to go over and study and travel and see a tremendous amount of Europe. He got to Poland, Germany, Austria, Ireland, Scotland, Italy, and France. One of the things that I remember was he told the story of every little town that he went to. Now, I don't know if anybody, no, you've never met my brother, he hasn't been able to visit, but he absolutely loves ice cream. And in every single town that he stopped in, no matter how big or small, Paris or tiny little village, he had an ice cream cone. And he always had a friend take a picture of him eating this ice cream cone. So his trip to Europe is filled with monumental ice cream cones. And one of the things about this trip was when he returned, there was a joy and a real excitement in telling the story. He wanted everybody in our family to see the photos, to hear the stories, to hear of his experience. And we all were just as excited to hear the stories as he was in telling them. Now I thought of this, I thought of his trip to Europe for a semester and his ice cream cones when I was thinking about what the Magi must have experienced. Now, they weren't going to see the world. Their trip wasn't one to seek adventure. They were going for a very specific purpose. They knew someone special had been born. A king of the Jewish people had been born, and they were going to go do him homage. But they also knew that this king was more than a king because they went to worship him. They brought him precious gifts and were overjoyed at the experience. But think about it for a minute. We know a fair bit about their journey. We know a fair bit about their meeting with Mary and Joseph and the child Jesus. But what do you think it was like when they got home? Think about your experiences. If you've ever had a large trip or a journey that was memorable, what did you do when you got home? I think if you were like my brother, or if you were like these Magi, you probably told people about your trip, what you encountered, who you met, what you learned, what you saw, and you wanted others to understand how wonderful of an experience it was. The Magi were no different. They were from the East. They were from Persia, Arabia, India, other parts of Asia, all over the East. They were not Jewish. And yet they knew and understood that God had entered human history in a very significant way, and they wanted to worship Him. And when they got home, they almost certainly told the story. People who were not Jewish were spreading the gospel just days after Jesus was born. The gospel was spreading through all corners of the world just days after Jesus was born. Weeks, months after he was born, he was still an infant lying in a cradle, and the world was beginning to hear about who God is and what God was doing, and that God had entered human history. Can you imagine? The first people to spread the gospel to the four corners of the world were not Jewish people, were not the apostles, were not priests, were not religious leaders. It was the Magi. It was the Magi who spread the gospel to the four corners of the world first, long before Jesus had worked his first miracle, long before he even spoke, let alone walked. The power of the message of who Jesus is and how God had entered our world was already beginning to be spread. I think we live in a world just like the one 2,000 years ago. We live in a world that needs to hear this gospel message. And if we think about these Magi, and who they were and what they did, I think it's important to ask ourselves the question, how do we get the message of Jesus shared in our world? The Magi were not religious leaders. They were not priests. They were kings and philosophers and scientists. They were astronomers. They were probably businessmen, maybe bankers. Some ancient stories say there was 3 of them. Other ancient stories say there were 12. There are a lot of ancient stories about these people, and they probably 1 or 2 were kings, and they were men of the world, just like you. They were people who spent their lives in the normal world outside of Bethlehem, just like you. They were not priests, religious leaders, or otherwise involved directly in the workings of religion, just like you. So often in our Catholic culture, I wonder at times if people don't think that it's the job of the nuns and the priests and the friars and the bishops and the Pope, it's their job to go spreading the gospel to the world. No. I live here. You don't. I work here. You don't. I preach the gospel here. You preach the gospel out there, just like the Magi. Pope John Paul II wrote very clearly in a letter in 1988, he said, it's the job of the laity, you, to spread the gospel to the world. It's your responsibility to be like the Magi, to be the ones who share the stories of your faith, share the experiences of Jesus in your life with the world outside these walls, with the world outside Bethlehem. You're the businessmen, you're the leaders, you're the politicians, you are the scientists, the philosophers, the ones who live and work in the real world. You live and work outside these walls. Please don't ever think that Father Robert, Father Raymond, and I are 3 wise men. You are. That's your job. That's your responsibility, to spread the gospel outside these walls. That's what the Magi did. They went home after encountering God who had come among us, Jesus in a manger. And they told the world, as soon as they got home, what they had found. They were the first ones to spread the gospel. Their role, their responsibility is now yours.